Hi, we're doing the chapter on policy learning, implementation, and feedback. My name is John Sibukakis,
And I'm Timothy Webster.
and we'll be doing our uh, presentation on that. The introduction, public policy, like other actions, is driven by social pressures, and tradition teaches us that politics is about conflict and power. So as we see in the current state of affairs, there's a huge contingent where of our society of our political society where conflict is going on in terms of what should be prioritized in current legislation, sort of a power struggle where two senators in one party, for example, are sort of dictating and holding up legislation, and they don't feel that two people should be withholding what 48 people of one party are for. So that's an example of that. Policy finds its sources not only in power but uncertainty. An example of this would be the 1994 crime bill, where the policymakers thought, we're doing something great, we're doing something noble, but the fact of the matter was that they actually did certain good things, but there were other issues that were uncertain at the time in terms of wrongful incarceration, excessive incarceration, and they actually ended up ruining lives. And you deal with that uncertainty on a number of levels in terms of cultivating policy. Policy is also a form of collective puzzlement on society's behalf. What I think what would be the case in that in terms of would be in terms of one trying to prioritize and see what society values or feels is currently on its issues of or its list of issues that need to be addressed in terms of priority and catering and uh, cultivating outreach to those issues. Uh, the author in our book, Hall, believed in utilizing an instrumental definition of learning. And he also argues that learning serves the objective of better goal attainment by governments. This means, in essence, that by listening and learning, you're able to gather information and use that information to create better and more focused policy goals and attainment and stuff that caters to the public and is of value to the public. Learning is a deliberate attempt to adjust goals or techniques of policy in the light of past consequences impacted by policy. So, like I reiterated earlier, or as I referenced earlier, not to reiterate again, but the 1994 crime bill, what the issue was that things that were not of consequence ended up becoming of consequence. People had issues finding jobs for things that, frankly, were on the more petty side, and that ended up being an inhibitor rather than an enabler. And that caused a big issue in terms of policy when it comes to that aspect. As the environment changes, policymakers must adapt if their policies are not to fail. That's sort of looking back, taking note of history, and sort of the cliche of let's not have history repeat itself, and let's address the changing landscape of policy. What is policy learning? Hall adopted an approach where societal forces allow policy formation to be characterized by learning rather than conflict. This means that, again, like I said earlier, it's more about attaining information and taking that information and using it towards creating better policy and better goals to address what society values and in order to solve problems that society has. One type of policy learning is referred to as classic conditioning, and this is referred to as the most normal form of policymaking. The second type is referred to as instrumental conditioning, and this argues that actions of policymakers are more uncertain. As I stated earlier, what you think is a problem now or won't be a problem now may change in 10 years or 20 years. That's just the nature of the beast, so to speak. And that is where you can be held responsible for issues occurring in the future when you didn't really intend for that to be the case. Uh, this includes various actors at various levels of government who are active in policy formulation, and this means that they use the data. Learning theory is the location of the agency in policy learning. This means, again, data, data, data. Learning what people need and listening and therefore trying to adjust policy to cater to that need. And it should be viewed more as a process of learning policy process as opposed to a process on conflict resolution. Government learning is also contingent on what universities teach. That's interesting because most people in government have either been educated at the university level or have postgraduate degrees. And therefore, what they're learning in the classroom and in their textbooks is probably going to have some type of imprint in terms of what they're going to prioritize in the future and in terms of what their mind and where their mind is at. And there are two types of learning: social learning and group learning. Uh, Elements of policy learning. One element of policy learning is what can be sold to the public. Another element is what that elected officials search for lessons by turning to those whose overall political values reflect theirs. Policy decision makers mostly are elected officials, as I said earlier. They're the ones casting votes. They are the ones dealing with coalitions, dealing with donors, dealing with lobbies, unfortunately, and that has an effect on what policy they value and where their head's at, so to speak. And advocacy coalitions combine elements of what are more commonly referred to as policy networks or policy communities. These are networks or policy communities are organizations that sort of act as a vessel of information and sort of reiterate what is on the mind of the current constituency and how you can go about addressing the needs of that constituency. And new research can be another element in terms of the policy landscape changing or shifting. You have to be able to adapt and you have to understand what's working and what doesn't work and how to go about addressing that and also how to voice that to the public so the public knows the current state of issues and why you're doing this or you're doing that. And governments have trouble bridging the gap or finding the link between intelligence and effectiveness. Policymakers have three alternatives when facing policy learning. One, to turn to their national past. Two, to speculate about the future. That's to sort of foresee potential problems down the line that could arise from that policy. And then the third would be to seek lessons from current experience in other places.
All right, so another element is policy implementation. So what is policy implementation? It's the process by which policies are enacted by the policymakers are put into effect by the relevant agencies. The study of policy implementation is concerned with what happens to a policy or program after it's been formulated. And one of the key elements of policy implementation is the implementers, the bureaucrats, discerning the intent and trying to figure out how to reach the implied goals. And this is a very tricky part. So the study of policy implementation kind of comes down to answering these two questions. What do policymakers want done and how should we enact it? So it's not a linear process, it's not simplistic, and it's not really well divided from the design phase. Design continues to happen even during the implementation process, oftentimes. So, people who are crafting these policies are attempting to anticipate the behaviors, but the actual implementation of a policy relies on different interactions between policy implementers, policy targets, and the like in a very complex environment. So nothing is happening in a vacuum. And so due to that, it's really important to understand policy implementation because it's a key process in any kind of policy process. It's a crucial step to the success or failure of a program or policy. Implementation can make or break. The best well-crafted legislation can fail very easily if this step is flubbed. So learning from past implementation problems helps to prevent those in the future. So studying policy implementation is all about trying to figure out how to reduce inefficiencies, how to make sure that policies are more successful going forward. And so, the study of policy implementation is basically focused on advising policymakers on how to better structure policies for a higher degree of success. And there's several different approaches, top down, bottom up, and then there's a synthesis approach. So policy implementation, the study of it kind of started early on in the 60s and 70s, and it was focused on individual cases. It didn't form a generalizable theory. So it was on a case-by-case basis. One example here, Oakland EDA, they were trying to put in, I believe, an expansion to an airport, and it took a very long time. It was a long, drawn-out process. Another was looking at President Johnson's war on poverty and some of the failings of those policies. And through looking at these individual cases, the main findings are that policy implementation is difficult. There's a lot of moving parts. There are people, organizations, all of the people in the process make it a little bit complicated. And because there's organizations and people and different levels in the process, clearances are needed for each stage of implementation. And so as you have more and more layers of clearance, you're going to have more and more likelihood of failure of policy. And this leads to something that they came up with at the time called the Pressman-Wadowski paradox. And this paradox is essentially like, since there's, even just 4 layers of clearances can actually lead to a only 60% like potential for success for a policy. So it leads to this paradox where it's like, how does anything happen? And so what's really interesting about this paradox is it was really kind of difficult to explain. And so they decided to later on get into looking at top down and bottom up approaches to figuring out, why are policies implemented and how is it even possible if this paradox is true? So looking at the top-down approach, that's going to focus on gaps between the drafters, the creators of the policy, and the implementers and the outcomes. And then bottom up, it looks at the lowest level, the street level bureaucrats, and goes up to finding where implementation is best and least successful, where these like frictions and gaps and blockages in the process are. And then there's a synthesis approach, which is a little bit more contemporary, and it bridges the top down and the bottom up to minimize the weaknesses of both. There's several different frameworks that we'll talk about. Richard Elmore had forward and backward mapping, and Paul Sabatier had a synthesis that's focused around advocacy coalition framework. So with the top down, it's a way of studying policy design and implementation that considers goals of the highest level policy designers and traces the design and implementation through to the lowest parameter, the street level bureaucrat, if you will. And the focus of this is on creating proper structures and controls to compel goals. So how do we structure this policy to make sure that it's going to be successful all the way down to the very bottom? Some assumptions about this approach. Policies have very clearly defined goals where performance can be measured. So there are performance metrics already in the policy. The goals are very clear cut. There's very little room for interpretation. Clearly defined goals are also, in this policy, the tools to accomplish these goals are clearly defined and also given. There's a single document or statute. There's a hierarchical implementation chain, like going from the top all the way down to the bottom, that describes each level, and each level has kind of control over the next one below it. And that designers of policy have a really good realistic knowledge of the capacity and the commitment of the implementers. So, do policymakers know what's happening on the street bureaucrat level? Do they have a good reading for what their capacity is, for their willingness to implement policy? Is it realistic? So obviously there are quite a number of weaknesses that come with this approach. One is that there's an emphasis on clear goals and objectives. We know that oftentimes in legislation and in policies, there is a pretty decent amount of kind of flex and ambiguity when it comes to definitions or exactly what intent is, even when they try to write it very specifically. The assumption that there is a single government is also kind of built into this top-down approach. And so looking at like just the federal government having all the power or something, it doesn't really take into account that there are lower level governments that also play a role in implementation. And those governments can delay policy strategically, or they can outright refuse to implement policy. And there are a couple of remedies for making sure that implementation is better guided. One of them is choosing who implements the policy, and the other is choosing the sanctions. What happens if you don't implement it? And then the other weakness, major weakness of this approach is that policy is contained to one document. It doesn't take into account the complex web of a policy sphere of different documents and statutes and things of that sort. So with policy, the bottom up implementation, this is a way of studying policy design and implementation that considers abilities and motivations of the lowest level implementers and tracks design from that level to the highest levels of government. So bottom up approach, street level bureaucrat up to policy policy crafter. The focus of this approach is understanding how conflict can be alleviated through bargaining and compromise to maximize goal achievement. So assumptions on this: goals are ambiguous, they conflict with other goals, and they also conflict with the motivations and the norms of street level bureaucrats. And so in order to kind of minimize these conflicts and this compliance problem between agencies, this is kind of one of the focuses of the bottom up approach. It also assumes that there's no single policy document or form required, and that it's kind of taking a holistic view of a policy community, all of the different things that interact with it, all the previous policies and other statutes and things of that sort. There are weaknesses to this approach too, though. So it overemphasizes the power of street level bureaucrats. There's a little bit more of an emphasis on their ability, their determinism for what's happening. And that is not necessarily the case oftentimes. It also assumes that groups are active participants in the process. Sometimes there are policies that don't have publics. Some of these very technical policies are not really things that people pay attention to. There aren't big coalitions for them, and sometimes they're really very uncontroversial. So this is a kind of a weakness in that assumption. And then there's it fails to consider that there are power differences between target groups. So some groups have way more power than others. A very well resourced oil lobby, for instance, or a very, very well resourced environmental lobby could be could really have a difference in this implementation. And then the synthesis approach. So this is the more contemporary one, and it's brought together to kind of minimize some of the weaknesses of the top-down and the bottom-up approaches. Several different frameworks for this one. So Richard Elmore created this forward and backward mapping. So doing both approaches, essentially, start doing the top-down and the bottom-up, and then taking a look at those processes and finding where those weaknesses and the links are. Paul Sabatier, he actually uses advocacy coalition framework for his approach to synthesizing. And so he starts with a bottom up perspective to look at all the actors, their concerns, their perspectives, their strategies. And then he uses the top down model to look at the system, make it a little bit more simple, and then recognize the important structural features of the system. So break it down into the essential components that really have this huge effect on these policies. And so using those two approaches, helping to synthesize that and have a better, more holistic view of implementation. And then there's this Goggins synthesis, which relies on the sending of messages between policymakers and implementers. So this is looking at those linkages between the two and considering those linkages as more of a form of communication and negotiation. So negotiation and communication kind of as commands, essentially. And looking at, so, ideally under this, clear messages from a credible official received by a receptive implementer, someone who's really, dedicated and wants to make sure that this policy works. The implementer has sufficient resources and they implement policies that are supported by the effective groups. So like that's the most ideal situation to a policy success. And so, obviously those elements aren't always true, but that's the best way to look at the process. And then that strategic delay can actually lead to improved implementation of policies through innovation, policy learning, and bargaining. So, this kicking the can down the road, pushing it off to the very end, kind of helps to figure out maybe where some issues in the policy are, where some issues in the implementation is, and might help kind of shape a more successful implementation of a policy. So the other topic that we had this week in the readings is policy feedback. And so policy feedback is looking at how does enacted policy restructure future political processes. So policy is going to have this effect. It's a layer building up on each other over time. So the bottom layers are going to have effects on the next layers up. Schatzsnyder says new policies create new politics. And that policies fundamentally shape the political environment through outcomes. So what the outcome of this policy is going to shape what happens next in this policy environment. And this policy feedback view kind of grew from a historical institutionalist tradition. And this is kind of policy feedback is studying and giving insight on how policy design and implementation also shape the attitudes and behaviors of participants. And it's a novel form of policy analysis. So here's some elements. There's 4 streams of policy feedback, and the meaning of citizenship, form of governance, power of groups, and political agendas and definition of. That you can see where a policy happens now. These 4 things are kind of filtered through, and then it leads to the next step in this chain of policy over time. So political agendas and problem definition. So policy is going to shape how problems are understood and how they're defined going forward. And that's also going to place it where it is on the political agenda. So maybe this policy is enacted and it reduces the level of concern. And so it might fall off of the agenda or go to the back of the line. Or a policy could be created. It might really ramp something up onto the agenda and cause it to be higher up on the agenda going forward. They can also require maintenance and oversight. So sometimes you have a sunset clause, or sometimes you have a policy that really needs to be re-examined. So that's going to move it back onto the agenda. And oversight of how policies are being implemented will also move it onto the agenda. And then it also can shape future conflicts and mobilize groups and grow and break coalitions. Governance. So this is probably the biggest one, in my opinion. Policies may affect future governance, and through shaping selected alternatives. Governance can change parameters and limits of government action. So it can give the government power to fix something, or it can take away government power to fix something. And oftentimes that last one might not be the case, but it really does shape exactly what is expected of government action. It shapes what is viewed as a legitimate domain of government. It takes a look at things that might have been conditions before that have now been shifted into the problem category and something that the government is expected to fix. Or maybe it's the opposite way, and it takes something that the government has been in, and people decide, or the view is decided that maybe the government doesn't have a role in that sphere anymore. And it also establishes resources and constraints. Power of groups. So groups can influence policy, but also policy can influence groups. Policy can create groups. Policy can bring together coalitions. Policy can also break groups and coalitions up. So this it's a really big part of the process here on bringing what groups together, and so that really feeds into the future of policy. And then last but not least, the meaning of citizenship. This is the other really big one. So policies affect the membership in political community. So the standing of legal citizens, who gets what rights they get. The franchise is a really big example of this. It started out with just white landowning males, then it was white males, and then we've gotten all the way down to everyone who is a citizen of the country is allowed to vote. But in that time, there's also Jim Crow laws that kind of shape what citizenship is and prevents people from voting. So like those things are also part of this meaning of citizenship phase here. And then identity. So how the state defines and sees an individual is actually under this category. And then how we view ourselves and how we view others. So policies can really shape perspectives on groups of people. It can create groups of people. And then it can design policies around those groups of people, which is a really interesting point there of the feedback process. And then here's a quick overview of the mechanisms. So think of this kind of as the black box of policy feedback, looking under the hood and seeing what's happening. So here you can see payments and goods and services. Those feed into resource effects and interpretive effects. So interpretive effects are the ability of policies to shape norms, values, and attitudes. Resource effects are, the effects of time, money, education. These can be offsets for participant costs, like participating in the policy process or in democracy. And then rules and procedures also kind of shape how people view the process, who can say what during the process, and those sorts of things. And then you see that these effects feed into civic capacity and civic predisposition. Is it feasible for someone to be involved in the process? Are there really high costs to be involved in the process? Are people already predisposed to be in the process and members of the community? Those things are shaped in this feedback mechanisms, and these lead to civic engagement. And so that's kind of a really quick overview of the policy feedback and its mechanisms. But we wanted to make sure that we got that in since it was a big part of the readings for the week. So we have a couple questions.
The questions are: one, what effects have coalitions had on social learning that influences legislation? And in terms of have they had any positive or negative effects on policy or public opinion towards that legislation? And the second question is, Paul Sabatier used the ACF as a base for his implementation synthesis. Why do you think that framework worked best for studying implementation? And what are some good policy examples that highlight the ACF's usefulness in terms of evaluating that implementation?
All right, so we hope you all enjoyed this recording, and we'll look forward to discussing the questions in class. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.